Welcome, everyone, to Smart Talk, where we speak with leading academics and other thoughtful persons on the important challenges facing the world today. My name is Edward Dodson. I am a longtime member of the faculty of the Henry George School of Social Science. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Yoram Bauman, whose formal education is in economics, but whose passion is poking fun at his chosen discipline. He tells us, "My goals in life are to spread joy to the world through economics comedy, to reform economics education, and to implement carbon pricing." Toward this last objective, he was instrumental in 2016 to getting the first ever carbon tax measure on the ballot in Washington state. He now lives in Salt Lake City and is working on a Utah campaign called Clean the Darn Air. Yoram Bauman is the author of several entertaining and insightful books that use cartoons to present basic economic principles and issues, as well as other subjects like climate change and calculus. A more traditional project was the 1998 book Tax Shift, co-authored with Alan Thien Durning. The Smart Talk audience is encouraged to read this book. Among its many virtues, the authors endorsed the taxation of land values as a means of bringing an end to endless sprawling development. When he is not performing before enthusiastic audiences, often of fellow economists, he can be found delivering serious lectures on the state of the world's climate. He tells us that the path toward a solution requires that we must make renewable energy cheaper than fossil fuels. How this is to be accomplished is part of what we will discuss with him today. Yoram Bauman, welcome to Smart Talk.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
Well, my first question to you is this. Are you still teaching in the classroom?
A little bit, occasionally. So I taught in an MBA program at the University of Utah back in spring of 2020. So that class went virtual halfway through, but that was actually my first teaching gig in a number of years. I mean, I think the honest truth is that for a while, I had it all, everything was falling in the right place, and economics comedy was actually paying the bills, believe it or not. Nobody believes that, but it's true. I have made a living doing stand-up comedy about economics. And then COVID hit, and it's been a little rocky since then. But
yeah. Well, for many of us, COVID has made life a bit rocky.
Yeah.
I just have a question about the quality of your students. I mean, based on your last teaching experiences, do you get a sense that they're far more committed to being open to new ideas about how economics ought to be taught and what they ought to be taught? Are they searching for answers to the serious problems that you raise?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's generally true. You know, economics doesn't have the greatest reputation in terms of the classroom experience, and so I try to lighten things up a little bit, and also, I mean, perhaps more importantly, right? Like, you want to try to connect it with people's lives. So I think there's an awful lot. I guess my serious take on economics education is that there's an awful lot of sort of Paul Samuelson's 1950s textbook that's still out there, and that stuff is great, but there have been all these developments in game theory and environmental economics and stuff since then, and I think those are, in some cases, they're more interesting for students. Like, it's more fun to talk about the prisoner's dilemma than it is to talk about short run average cost curves. And the environmental stuff, I think, is connected to people's lives also, a number of students who are interested in that. And so I think there's opportunities to not hide our light under the bushel, I think, is the expression.
As I'm sure you've heard often, there's a great deal of criticism about how neoclassical economics is taught and the fact that it does not really express how the real world operates. And that's the message that I get constantly. And the other economists that I work with on a regular basis, they've taken that to heart, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, I see both sides of that. I mean, I think that it's important to connect economics and classes and other classes too to people's lives. I'm actually I'm a reasonably mainstream neoclassical economist, so I'm happy to argue about that. But really, that's because for the things that I work on, like environmental tax reform, I don't really see a reason to move out of that, right? Like the idea of carbon taxes or land value taxes, for that matter, I think is squarely in the mainstream of economics, including neoclassical economics, and you can certainly move outside that to ecological economics and things like that. But I actually think that the I'm going to sound very square here, but the mainstream of economics like understands things like externalities and market failures um, and things like that. So I feel like I don't want to give it too much of a bad rap.
Well, hopefully we'll have a chance to explore that a little bit more as our conversation moves along. I wanted to ask you, when did you discover that you had this ability to interject humor in talking about economic subjects? I mean, was that at a very young age, or it just sort of came upon you at some point?
Yeah, so I was interested in comedy since I was a kid, but my brother, who's older than me, claims that I was not terribly funny growing up. But when I was in graduate school at the University of Washington, I was teaching undergraduate classes, and so I got free copies of textbooks from folks who wanted me to try to use the textbook in their class. And one of the textbooks was Greg Mankiw's Principles of Economics textbook, very popular textbook. And it's based on these 10 principles of economics. And I ended up writing a parody of the 10 principles of economics, because that's what you do. And
I've listened to it a number of times, and I recommend to our audience that they do so as well. Preparing for this conversation with you, I remember the comedian Dan Novello, who took on the persona of Father Guido Sarducci back when he performed for Saturday Night Live. And he did a really funny routine about starting the 5-minute university. In 5 minutes, students would learn what they'd be likely to remember 5 years after leaving school. And on economics, the answer would be supply and demand. On business, you buy something and you sell it for more. And it's a really funny routine that I also recommend to our audience if they've never seen it before. He gives them a diploma at the end of the 5 minutes. They have a ceremony. He takes their photograph and sends them on to law school. But I think the humor is really valuable in such a serious subject. In my own classroom teaching, I've had students laugh at plenty of things I've said, although I hadn't intended to be humorous. But that's what helps keep people interested, and I think as you go through these subjects. More seriously, when did you begin to realize that the economics you were taught still needed further development? I mean, you've talked about the textbook that you utilized, and in your comedy, you sort of raise the fact that there are failings in this analysis. So when did it start to occur to you that what you were being taught in the university needed to be further developed or enhanced or revised?
Well, let me add a comment about Guido Sarducci first for a moment. There's a quote that I really like, which I think may have actually come from the Bulwer Lytton Bad Writing Contest. So it may be a fake quote, but the quote is that education is like a warm oven. The food is gone, but the heat remains. It's very deep. All right. So, when I was a graduate student, I took a couple of economics classes in undergraduate. Came across this idea of environmental tax reform, like higher taxes on bad things, lower taxes on good things. So like higher taxes on carbon emissions, lower taxes on jobs and income and savings and investment. Kind of the idea that Al Gore summarized as tax what we burn and not what we earn. And I remember thinking that was kind of this intellectually beautiful idea, and that one that might actually work in the real world. And when I don't have my comedy hat on, when I do serious economics and activism, I've spent a bunch of my career banging my head against that wall. Before all that, though, I went to graduate school and I did some TAing for other faculty members for the senior faculty there. And there's kind of this idea that the fellow I TA'd for, a guy named Paul Hain, who's not alive anymore, but his idea was that you want to teach students how the car works properly before you talk about how the car might be broken. And I was never super comfortable with that, because a lot of students will never take a second class in economics, right? I mean, there's a lot of, if you're just taking, there's a lot of the economics curriculum that's sort of built towards economics majors, I would say. And so if you are taking introductory micro and then you're also taking intermediate micro and then a bunch of advanced classes, then that's a different approach to teaching than if you're coming at it, I think, from the view that 80% of the students have, which is that they're taking one class in economics or maybe one micro class and one macro class, and then that's it. In which case, I think it calls for a little bit more flexibility in terms of talking about market failures and environmental tax reform and things like that.
That was my experience. I was a business administration major, and so I had the required micro and macro courses, and I really didn't think too much about, economics as a discipline for many years after, although constantly worried about what was happening in the real world in the economy and listening to economists of different stripes talk about, from a very different perspective, what was happening. So on one hand, you're listening to John Kenneth Galbraith, and on the other hand, you're listening to Milton Friedman, and then all the different voices on economics in between that are media personalities. And I think for many of us who haven't studied economics to the depth that you do when you're earning a PhD, become very skeptical about what economists really know. And certainly that's within the Henry George community, that skepticism is pretty deeply felt because of the particularly recently of the failure of economists to forecast the 2008 crash and then to explain why it occurred. I know that's not your specialty. Your specialty of interest is environmental economics, but I think that does cause the public to have a very skeptical view of what we hear from what we think of as our experts. Right?
I think that's fair. It's especially in the macroeconomics realm. There's a lot more disagreement among professional economists, academic economists, than there is, for example, among climate scientists about climate change.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of areas of agreement, and I don't want to get into the financial crisis. I think just because that's not my area of expertise. But I will say that I think it's important to separate the economic theory issues from the political challenges. And my sense, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but what I can tell you is that among academic economists, 99% of them think that carbon pricing is a good idea. And my sense is that
I'm glad to hear you say that, of course, because I think carbon taxing is very consistent with Henry George's proposal to capture economic rents. And back in 2012, I found a quote of yours from the New York Times in which you described the carbon tax in British Columbia as, quote, the best climate policy in the world. And at the time, the charge I guess, for every metric ton of carbon dioxide was increased in British Columbia. And I wondered if you could update us, if you know what's been happening in British Columbia, and is British Columbia still a best practice?
Oh, so what was really neat, in my view, about the carbon tax in British Columbia was that it was a revenue neutral carbon tax, meaning that the money that came in from the carbon tax was offset with reductions in other taxes. So it was instead of increasing the overall size of government, the idea was let's sort of make the tax system smarter instead of making the tax system bigger. And so they would use the revenue from the carbon tax to reduce, principally income taxes in the province of British Columbia. That happened for a number of years. Actually, the carbon tax was implemented, believe it or not, by a right of center government in British Columbia, the confusingly named Liberal Party, but liberal like libertarian, where the premier at the time, Gordon Campbell, just said, look, climate change is important. This is the way to tackle it. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a carbon tax, and $30 per ton of CO2 at the time, and still now, is a reasonably hefty carbon tax. It's about 30 cents a gallon of gasoline, 3 cents a kilowatt hour of coal-fired power. So we're going to have this carbon tax to give everybody, households, businesses, utilities an incentive to reduce emissions, right? But we're going to use the revenue from the carbon tax to offset existing taxes.
Does it
And so
have
that was,
an effective spillover effect, with regard to other kinds of outcomes that occur when we don't tax carbon, like sprawl? Is Vancouver still sprawling in the way that it had been, or has this had any effect that environmentalists would hope it have of more intensive land use close in where the infrastructure already exists?
yeah, I mean, I think a carbon tax probably has a modest impact on that, just because you think about 30 cents a gallon of gasoline, it's not going to be, a huge factor in terms of how much people drive or things like that. I do think that Vancouver is a very dense city.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that I wouldn't give the carbon tax a whole lot of credit for that. But one thing that happened is so the carbon tax went up to $30 per ton of CO2. And then the Liberal Party was knocked out of power. This was the right of center party, and the left of center party, the NDP, came into power, and they eventually decided that they were going to continue increasing the carbon tax rate, but they stopped making it revenue neutral. So for better or worse, the additional revenue from the carbon tax in BC, which I believe is now at or near $50 per ton of CO2, it goes towards green programs and things like that. And Canada as a whole has a carbon price policy that that each province is supposed to sort of meet minimum requirements to put a price on carbon. So all that's pretty great.
And your work is now moved from Washington State to Utah. And I listened to you talk about the weather issues in Salt Lake City, that there are some pretty serious inversion problems with pollution. And I guess the campaign you're working on right now is am I correct, to use the carbon tax as a way to help minimize the air pollution problem?
Yeah, so there is local air pollution is a big problem here along the Wasatch Front. I live in Salt Lake City. And, it's a top 3 political issue. And you've got these inversions in the wintertime that are kind of a combination of what I would describe as kind of bad, unfortunate topography, in the same way that Los Angeles has bad topography. So bad topography, lots of people in industry. And Utah, is a very red state, doesn't regulate the way that California does. So I think those 3 issues are relevant. And so that's a top 3 issue. And now we're seeing, just since in the 4 years that I've been here, we're seeing an increase, what seems like an increase anyway, in summertime pollution problems related to wildfires. And so I would say that both of those things are connected to burning fossil fuels, either through the climate change impacts on wildfires, or just directly the burning of fossil fuels is one of the major contributors to the inversions in the wintertime. And so the Clean the Darn Air effort, and if you want to find out more, you can go to our website, which is darnair.org. The policy that we're trying to get on the ballot here in Utah in 2024. So we're fine-tuning the policy right now. We'll collect signatures in 2023 and put it on the ballot in November 2024, is $100 million a year for local clean air programs. So cleaner school buses, trade-in programs for folks to swap their lawn and garden equipment for electric, things like that. And the $100 million a year was actually a budget request that wasn't fulfilled, but a budget request from Governor Herbert a couple of years ago. So $100 million a year for clean air programs, $50 million a year for rural economic development, eliminate the sales tax on grocery store food, which is another big political issue here in Utah, and pay for it all with a modest carbon tax on the fossil fuels that contribute to local air pollution and global climate change. So the summary pitch is that we're going to tax pollution instead of potatoes and put the money that's left over into cleaning the darn air. But I think you can see that the basic idea is one of the same things that I've been working on for quite a while now, which is we should have higher taxes on bad things and lower taxes on good things.
Yeah, it's a complex dynamic that occurs. We would argue that all the good that you're going to accomplish may be eventually capitalized into higher and higher land prices, so that as you do, free up the economy from the deadweight losses attached to certain taxes, without the transfer of the public revenue system to land rent, that it won't have the deep effect that one would hope for, just because of that way the land markets work. Have you looked at that connection at all in your work? I mean, in tax shift, you do, argue for a tax on land value. So I wonder how you think about the two policies merging together to work together.
The way I think about them is really, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think that I think they're both policies where academic economists are pretty much on board, but that the challenges are in the political realm, right?
Yeah.
Like
You're absolutely right.
If you take a class in public finance, you can learn about, efficient taxes. And that's what economists focus on, is like, how do you get revenue with the least amount of distortions or impose corrective taxes or things like that, right? But I think what I've learned from being out in the real world with normal people is that most people don't think about taxes that way. They don't think about efficiency. Most people think about taxes as fundamentally an issue of fairness. And people have what, as an economist, I would describe as some unexpected ideas about fairness, right? Like, if you ask, a lot of people think, for example, that sales taxes are fair, right? Because supposedly everybody pays the sales tax, but that doesn't really take into account that a lot of things that higher income folks spend money on disproportionately, like healthcare, education, aren't subject to the sales tax. Not to mention, savings and things like that. So as an economist, I can say, hey, sales taxes are quite regressive. As a percentage of income, lower income households pay a lot more of their income in sales taxes than higher income households do. But if you ask the person on the street will say sales taxes are fair. And so I think that political challenge is one that, that's the wall that we keep banging our heads against. And
it's certainly proven. It's proven to be the case for over a century, and we go through these battles over what's the right sort of way to raise public revenue. And certainly, I think the big change occurred when Art Laffer came up with the idea of supply side economics and sold it to the conservative Republicans. But he also sold it with the idea that lower marginal tax rates on higher ranges of income would generate higher federal revenue. And unfortunately, that part of the prescription never came to fruition. So we have this history of battles over what's the right public policy. I wonder whether or not our politicians have much energy to study the actual implications of these policy choices. And
I think they have the energy to study them. Like in Washington State, there have been lots of study bills about studying the tax system. The question is, do they have the energy to actually change things? Because changing things is hard. Like the premier in British Columbia who implemented the carbon tax actually got kicked out of office a couple of years later because of a different tax reform measure that he tried to push through. So about the harmonized sales tax, I believe it was. So it wasn't about the carbon tax, but it was about another tax measure. And, if you look at, since I spent 20 years in Washington State, I can tell you that Washington State and Oregon, just to the south of Washington, right? They're very similar states in many ways. But Washington has a sales tax and no income tax. Oregon has an income tax and no sales tax. And both states, the people there have vehemently rejected opportunities to adopt, a different tax system. Voters in Washington State have repeatedly rejected income taxes. Voters in Oregon have repeatedly rejected sales taxes. And, I think a lot of it is just that people kind of they prefer the devil they know to the devil they don't know. There's a lot of skepticism in the general public about not just taxes, but any kind of public policy issue where there's a tendency, whether you want to call it cynicism or what have you, but there's a tendency to sort of say, well, things may not be great right now, but any changes are going to make things worse for me. and that leads you to just say no and to sort of stick with the system that you have, even if it's not all that great.
That's certainly my experience in my professional work. I worked on affordable housing initiatives at Fannie Mae for 10 years, and uh, it was always amazing how much local opposition there was to changing zoning densities in order to increase the supply of affordable housing, even when the potential beneficiaries were the adult children of people who lived in the neighborhoods. They'd rather have their commute an hour to go visit their families on a highway than have the ability of their young adult children and their families grow up in the same area. It's a difficult challenge politically to get people to understand the long-term benefits of certain policy changes versus the short-term implications for them today or tomorrow. And I think that's what the work that you're doing is enormously important. And I'm sure that is one of the challenges that you face on an ongoing basis. I wonder, in addition to what's being done in Canada, is there any place in the United States that you would identify as following best practices?
In terms of climate change and climate
Yeah,
policy?
in terms of climate change, the use of tax policies and a combination of incentives for people to behave and perform consistent with the longer term objectives.
Yeah, so I will out myself as you know, on the center/conservative side of the political spectrum, and say that a lot of the climate policies that are out there, they're either regulatory policies, which, you know, maybe they're the best that you can do, they're second best, whatever, or they're carbon pricing policies, but the revenue from the carbon price, whether it's a carbon tax directly or auctioning permits, you know, goes towards programs that I would say have some questionable value. So, you know, like the high-speed rail line in California, that's, you know, supposed to connect San Francisco and Los Angeles, and I think is currently on track to connect Bakersfield and Fresno or something like this. There's it's very difficult, and this is what I encountered in the ballot measure that I worked on, right? The Initiative 732 campaign in Washington State in 2016. We said, hey, let's have a carbon tax. Let's use the revenue to cut the state sales tax and fund an earned income tax credit benefit for low-income working families. We thought that was a pretty smart policy. I still think it's a pretty smart policy, but we ended up getting a lot of opposition from the left side of the political spectrum, from folks, including Governor Inslee, you know, including the Sierra Club, a bunch of the environmental community, who basically wanted the Green New Deal. Like they wanted the revenue from the carbon tax, but they wanted to spend it on their priorities as opposed to cutting existing taxes. And so that's hard.
Yeah, that's, I mean, certainly my interaction with, you know, people who self-describe themselves as progressives and maybe are left-oriented, they have very little faith that markets can be made competitive and that markets can operate in the interest of the general public. And you know, it's a skepticism that's deeply ingrained because of what we've experienced, you know, for decades now, I think, in the United States. And trying to, I mean, Henry George is basically an individualist. He believes in capitalism. He believes in markets, but he also argues that markets will not operate to the benefit of society until monopoly is dealt with. And we still have in our economic system, with the laws that we live under, just an amazing set of benefits that go to rent-seeking type behavior, rent-seeking type investments over the production of goods and services. And unfortunately, I don't hear many economists talking about that sort of, you know, contradiction. And maybe, you know, it's just not politically interesting, or I don't know the reason, but other than a few economists who have really strongly embraced Henry George's ideas over the years, Mason Gaffney at the University of California was probably the most prominent member of that community. It just doesn't find its way into the public discourse. How do we convince people that markets can, in fact, achieve beneficial outcomes for all participants? That there's no
right. Yeah, but you have to set up the structure properly, right? You have to set up you have to design the incentives in the right way. So the way that I describe economics in my cartoon micro book is by saying that economics is about the actions and interactions of optimizing individuals, and that the key question is, under what circumstances does individual optimization lead to outcomes that are good for the group as a whole? Right, and I think that's what you're talking about, where rent seeking is one of these cases where individual optimization leads to bad outcomes for the group as a whole, because you dissipate a lot of economic value that way. And climate change is another one, and with externalities and market failures and things like that. And what's kind of interesting to me about economics, is that there's not an easy answer to that question. You have some folks who want to say that markets always work, and you have some folks who want to say that markets never work. And the truth, at least as I believe it and understand it, is that markets sometimes work, and that if you provide correct incentives with things like internalizing externalities with tax system, then you can get markets to work better.
Well, I remember Adam Smith always referred to as the architect of laissez-faire economics. If one reads The Wealth of Nations, he was very much in support of government intervention in the economy on behalf of competitive forces. He saw government as the appropriate referee to make sure that markets operated without monopoly. But that seems to that's forgotten by those who use the term laissez-faire to describe their economic beliefs.
Yeah, and then on the other side, you have I think there is, like you said, the general public has some skepticism about markets, perhaps warranted in cases, but I think they also have some skepticism that's also warranted in cases about government action and the things like the Green New Deal, where there was a policy in a very good study done by Michael Greenstone and Meredith Fowley at UC Berkeley, so some very high-powered economists looking at a home energy retrofit program that was run in Michigan. And if you go and you read this paper, what you find is that there were incredible challenges of getting people to sign up for the program that was going to provide free energy retrofits for their houses, right? And then when they actually did the energy retrofits, the results were not nearly as promising as the energy models had suggested, and you end up with programs that are kind of disappointing. And so that's why I kind of like to keep it simple where you can, and say like, hey, let's have like the policy that worked on in Washington State, let's have a carbon tax, let's cut the state sales tax and call it a day.
Yeah, even proponents of Henry George's ideas at the local level, the taxation of land values, usually start in a discussion with political leaders of opting for a revenue neutral shift. Mm-hmm. And then let's see what happens. If good things happen, then we'll do more. If more good things happen, we'll do even more. Is that in a sense what you think is the appropriate way to incrementally get to where we need to be with the carbon tax and with other pollution taxes?
That's kind of the way that I think about it, but I should be clear here that when I say that, I take off my economist hat and I put on my pundit hat, and I'm not necessarily any better of a pundit than anybody else out there. So the campaign I worked on in Washington State didn't pass in 2016. Who knows what will happen with the measure I'm working on here in Utah? I think it's a smart way to do it. One of the other ideas that I've been exploring lately that I'm kind of I'm entranced with right now is, you can tell I'm an economist because I'm entranced with tax policy issues. One of the challenges with carbon pricing is that it makes things like gasoline and electricity more expensive. And a lot of people don't like that, right? Like voters don't like that, and legislators are hesitant to get behind it. But it turns out that in many states, uh, states like Arizona, Georgia, New York, Pennsylvania, South Dakota, Nebraska, there are a bunch of states that have sales taxes on electricity. So if you look at your residential electric bill, you see a sales tax. Right now, the sales tax raises the price of electricity, but doesn't give anybody an incentive, doesn't give the utilities an incentive to change where they're getting their power from. Right? If you get the power from coal or from wind, you're still paying the sales tax. So the idea I've been exploring with some compatriots in various states is, what if you got rid of the sales tax on electricity and replaced it with a carbon tax on electricity? Or even simpler, what if you just said, hey, let's give a clean energy tax cut, let's cut the sales tax rate on electricity based on how clean the utility is, how clean its carbon emissions are, right? It's the carbon intensity of its output. And so consumer bills wouldn't necessarily go up at all in that case, but the utilities would have an incentive to move away from fossil fuels. So that's
with the incentive being that consumers could opt to move their source of electrical power to a clean energy supplier.
So that's a possibility in some states where there's electricity choice. But I think even in other states, so Nebraska, for example, is 100% public power. So all of the utilities are run by essentially by agencies where the board of directors are voted on by the people, right? So they have an incentive to say, okay, let's figure out the way to minimize the costs of providing electricity for our customers. And if there's a financial incentive to move in the direction of lower carbon power, then they have a reason to do that. I think even investor-owned utilities, though, even in states where there isn't a consumer choice on electricity, the utilities are all regulated monopolies, and they're regulated by by something like the Public Service Commission in Georgia, and they're supposed to pursue least cost power, right? And so if you had a carbon tax or this clean energy tax cut idea that changed what the least cost power source was, moved it from fossil fuels to nuclear, renewables, whatever, then that would presumably filter through the utility commission's decisions and through the choices that the utilities put before the Public Utility Commission. So I think it works in places where there's consumer choice, but I think it works in other cases as well.
How do you view the whole idea of cap and trade and the creation of a secondary market for selling pollution rights?
Well, so the economics of it is pretty simple. It's that cap and trade is kind of an oddly shaped kind of carbon tax, right? So pretty much any policy that you could implement with cap and trade, you can come up with a roughly equivalent carbon tax. So,
well, the argument against it, the one that I have bought into, is it simply creates fee income for brokers, and it really doesn't do anything to reduce the aggregate amount of carbon that's being entered into the atmosphere.
No, I think that if you have a well-designed policy, then you'll see impacts. I think that one of the challenges that a lot of cap and trade programs have had historically is that they issue too many permits, right? And so when you issue too many permits, you get a very low permit price, and you don't get a very, there's not much of a market incentive to reduce emissions. But that's what happened in the European ETS program, for example. But they've kind of resolved that. And now I think one of the challenges in Europe is that energy prices have gone up quite a bit, in part because of unrelated issues in the natural gas market. But I think the cap and trade system is adding to that. And again, I think you see with the yellow vest movement in France, like there's an argument that says, hey, look, people are concerned about the end of the month in addition to the end of the world, and you got to figure out, in my view, a way to put money back into their pockets, right? To make people whole so that they can say, hey, this is a smart environmental policy or a smart, property tax policy, but I can support it because, if there's an increase in taxes over here, there's a reduction in taxes over there.
I wonder what your views are with regard to the renewed emphasis on moving away from gasoline powered automobiles and trucks. and adopting electrical vehicles. And my reason for thinking about this is that lithium batteries are pretty expensive, and it seems that this is going to be some sort of it's going to have a regressive impact, particularly on lower and moderate income households, if gasoline powered automobiles are no longer being manufactured and they have to enter the market at a time when the supply of lithium available to put in the batteries is not going to increase exponentially, but it may result in very expensive automobiles. Have you given any thought to the impact of this shift?
Well, let me answer that in part by telling you what I love about carbon pricing. And what I love about carbon pricing is if you put a price on carbon, then the market takes care of all that, right? And if if lithium batteries are too expensive, then the market keeps gas-powered cars for a while and looks for sort of the low-hanging fruit. Okay, and if you're not getting enough carbon reductions, then you can raise the carbon price. You do see these regulations and about phasing out internal combustion engines. There's potentially some benefits to doing that. And again, I want to recognize that climate change is a very difficult political challenge, right? So I don't want to sit here as a pointy-headed economist and say, well, this is the only way to do it is with a carbon tax. But you raise, I think, some reasonable concerns about ultimately people are going to want to be able to get from point A to point B. And, if you're banning internal combustion engines and you're not giving them a reasonable alternative, then they're probably going to be unhappy.
Well, the internal combustion engines aren't going to disappear even if we went full speed ahead with electric powered vehicles. It's going to be 25 years before all of those vehicles are aged and off the road. I mean, my family, we still are driving a 2003 Toyota Camry that still functions very well. So I have no incentive to purchase an electric powered car as long as that Camry is on the road and continues to ride very nicely. But I mean, these are very difficult issues, as you say, politically. While economists can argue the efficiency issues, the equity and fairness issues are the ones that seem to have where economists have the most difficulty in expressing the link with proposed policy or existing public policy. Would you agree with that?
I think that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, at the Henry George School, our emphasis in teaching is very much on justice. It's very much on the issues of what sort of system, economic system produces the most just outcomes, and what do we need in terms of governmental intervention, systems of law and public policy to achieve that outcome. And as you've indicated, it is a very difficult thing to explain to people that how they're living currently may in fact result as a beneficiary of entrenched privilege under law. And that for the good of humanity, we should be eliminating this entrenched privilege. But how do you then give people the right incentives to agree with those changes? And it seems to me that the potential damage of climate change now has become the one message in the public policy discussion that will convince people that their style of living may have to change in order to save the planet and save humanity from ourselves. Is that too deep of a cynicism?
No, it might not be cynical enough, because I'm not convinced that people are really there, right? Like if you look at, I think Maine had a ballot measure where it was about a power line, and it got voted down to bring more hydropower, I think, down from Canada. I think you still see a lot of sort of NIMBYism, the not in my backyard idea. And I'm not, even though I think climate change is important and I spend a lot of time working on it, right? I recognize that a lot of people, um, especially here in states like Utah, but I think even in left-leaning states, if you ask people, do you want to, should we do something about climate change? They'll say yes. If you say, okay, like how much are you willing to pay in a higher electricity bill in order to tackle climate change? Usually the answers are pretty modest, right? Which is why I keep coming back to these ideas about like, hey, let's have a carbon tax and cut the sales tax. Let's have a carbon tax and eliminate the sales tax on groceries. Let's, eliminate the sales tax and electricity, replace it with a carbon tax and electricity. I keep trying to come back to ideas that are pocketbook friendly.
Yeah, as the saying goes, the perfect is the enemy of the good. And we have to fight, we have to try to get something good and get people to accept that some advantage to them has occurred, even as they may have to sacrifice in some other ways. This gets me to another area of public discussion now that's really taken off, and that is the universal basic income idea. I don't know if you've given much thought to this, but I did want to ask you about it, because there is potential with natural resource rents, even the carbon tax, to create a sufficient fund that would allow for a universal basic income. And from my perspective in studying Henry George, the fund should come from rents of whatever source. I mean, not just land value, but there are plenty of other sources of rents that could be tapped to provide this.
Yeah, so there's a group called Citizens Climate Lobby that works on what they call fee and dividend, which is, and I think it was perhaps based in part on a book that Peter Barnes wrote many, many years ago called Sky Trust that said,
right.
Let's have a carbon tax, but then let's dividend the money back to everybody. So everybody gets we collect all the carbon tax from everybody, and then we send everybody a check. And you still have an incentive to reduce emissions because the amount of the check that you get depends on how much everybody emits, right? So if you can find ways to become lower carbon, then you pay less in carbon taxes, but you still get essentially the same check back because the check is based on an aggregate of 300 million people. So I think that's a reasonable idea. When I generally hear the universal basic income idea, like it seems to me to be sort of an order of magnitude larger than what many of the folks who talk about carbon taxes or fee and dividend are talking about, right? Like a fee and dividend policy might, reasonably send households maybe $600 a year, and that would be a pretty hefty carbon tax. I think $600 a year. But if you're talking about a universal basic income, you're talking about paying people, $10,000 a year or whatever it is. So again, I'd say that there's kind of an order of magnitude difference between those two ideas. Although it's, you could reasonably argue that the dividend is sort of a step along the road towards something like a UBI.
Yeah, because my area of writing is been focused on affordable housing for many years. My concern about a universal basic income is that without some policy to construct more affordable housing, the increase in disposable income to lower and moderate income families will simply be capitalized by the market into higher apartment rents and housing prices or property prices. And so while I'm very much in agreement with you that we need to try to get the markets to function effectively, efficiently, that in this case, it seems to me that the only answer is to have significant public subsidy, direct public subsidy of the construction of affordable housing. You're shaking your head. You seem to be nodding. So are you in agreement that is a necessary
subsidies for public housing?
Yes.
Housing policy is also not one of my areas of expertise.
But just basic, it's a basic, expression of what happens in markets. And that is, if you increase the demand side of the equation without increasing the supply side, you're going to get increase in price. And when we're not building sufficient affordable housing to deal with the homeless crisis we have in the country. And so
I think that is a very reasonable concern to have, is about universal basic incomes getting capitalized into higher rents and things like that. The reason why I'm a little hesitant is you say, well, let's subsidize more public housing, and there are so many challenges with the housing market, not just about lack of land value taxes, but also with zoning and things like this, that I hesitate to put a foot down on that. But I do think that if you look at California, for example, where they've had these huge battles in California about about measures to allow for more housing near transit stations.
Yeah. Or
just measures in general to allow for more housing. I think they just passed a bill that said, okay, on a single family lot, you can now build a duplex. I think, as your experience, as you mentioned, a lot of policies that seem pretty reasonable end up getting a lot of opposition from, kind of from the NIMBY crowd. So politically, I think that's a tough nut to crack.
We have many of them.
Carbon pricing is hard too.
I have students. I teach adult education, so I have people returning to my classroom year after year, and I try to teach them the fundamentals of how the economies operate. And it seems to me that 1 year, 2 years, 3 years of study, coming to class every week, having discussion, and then after the third year, they still ask some very fundamental questions. And I wonder, how can I be such a poor teacher? Maybe Guido Sarducci was absolutely right, but it's not even 5 years after you leave your formal study. It's 5 days. It's a challenge getting people to think differently about the world than they've been taught to think as they've become adults, the influences they've had in their lives growing up, their family, and even their favorite mentors, if they have a mentor who was a favorite mentor as a teacher.
People sometimes say that the solution to climate change is more education, like public education, and I sometimes joke that I'm one of the founding members of a group called Educators Against Education. Just because, at least my experience in the classroom, and this sounds roughly similar to what you just said, is that you should have pretty modest expectations about educating even people who are in the class, who are dependent on you for a good grade or whatever, right? Much less educating the general public about some issue. It's just, it is very difficult to do that, and I think you're right that you'll see cases where people can give you the right answer on the test, and then they'll go outside of the classroom and they won't have internalized the lesson. It's hard.
Well, you've talked about, one of your objectives in life is to reform economics education. Are you asked to speak to other economics professors or even high school economics teachers about how they deliver, curriculum, and do you have recommendations for them to be more effective and reach their students and increase retention levels?
I've done a little bit of that, but I'll be pretty modest about it. I think that the cartoon books that I've written, the Cartoon Introduction to Micro and Macroeconomics, I think they're fine books, and I think that they point out something that a lot of educators miss, which is that there's an incredibly important role for motivation, right? Like, it's not like you don't have information on the web or in your 600-page textbook. I just think that there are a whole lot of students out there who just don't open the textbook and do what they need to do in order to pass the test. And if you can get, and this is kind of the goal of the cartoon books, is not to teach everything that you need to know about economics in one cartoon book. It's to motivate readers to want to learn more, right? Because if you can get students to want to learn more, then they can find ways to learn more.
Well, you've provided me a great incentive to pick up copies of those books, and so I can begin to learn a little bit more about some of the nuances of teaching economics. I mean, that's the I know enough mainstream economics to get by in the classroom and compare what is being taught in economics with political economy that I'm, more familiar with. And
yeah, you should pick up the books, and I'll get 25 cents in royalties, and then you can tell me how I did.
My own books are available on Amazon.com. I wrote a 3-volume work titled "The Discovery of First Principles." The first draft I thought was going to be a 1-volume book about 300 pages, and after 7 years of research and writing, I had an 1,800-page manuscript.
Wow.
It's not sold particularly well, but I think Amazon, I think the booksellers think I'm deceased because they keep raising the price, actually. So,
yeah, I will say, like, when I do comedy, and I would love to come and do some comedy at the Henry George School or elsewhere once COVID passes. My job is to make people laugh for an hour and hopefully think about some economics. And that's fundamentally a different challenge than the challenge that educators face who are in the classroom, every day. And, when I teach classes, I warn my students that I'm not going to be hilarious every day. And I might not be hilarious ever, right? Like, you've got content you got to cover, and, it's,
well, perhaps our education director, Ibrahim Adram, will convince you to come back and do a seminar or a workshop for us over Zoom, and we'll be able to attract an audience for you that'll take you on in a serious way and give you some things to think about, but also listen intently to what you have to say. So
great. I would love that.
Yoram, this has been really enjoyable. I'll give you the last, word. If there's a message that you'd like to deliver to the audience that's going to tune into this that we haven't discussed so far, please feel free to enlighten us before we close out our session today.
Well, I haven't really told any jokes, so I feel like I should at least point people to my website, standupeconomist.com, and tell a couple of jokes about, the stereotypes about economists. So I have a bunch of "you might be an economist if" jokes. You might be an economist if you don't read human interest stories because they don't interest you. If you might be an economist if you've ever gone to a bank or other financial institution in the hopes of getting a date. If you plan to have your children born in December instead of January so that you can maximize the discounted present value of child tax credit. And finally, you might be an economist if you adamantly refuse to sell your children because you think they'll be worth more later.
Yeah.
So,
those are all great.
There you go.
Hey, it's been wonderful meeting you and having this opportunity to have a conversation with you. And I hope that maybe we can do this again in a few years. And by then you'll be able to report some enormous successes with the campaign in Utah. And
I hope so. Absolutely.
And I'll be able to report that we've made some progress in terms of affordable housing, funding, and land value taxation being implemented.
Well, good luck to us all.
Yep. Thank you. And well, that's it for this edition of Smart Talk. For more information on this and other episodes, please visit our website, henrygeorgeschool.org. I'm Edward Dodson, and thank you all for watching Smart Talk.